Lexington 911, where's your emergency?
Yes, my name is I'm at 541 West Short.
Do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
I believe police. We just we heard a shot fired and a woman screaming.
Do you know where it came from, sir?
Either in the back of our house or somewhere to the side of our house.
Okay.
It's a townhouse community.
Okay, I'm showing that you're 541 West Short, number...
Correct.
Okay, and it's to the back of you?
To the back, to the side of us. We're not really sure. Obviously, the shot was fired, we think. And I'm not an expert at guns.
How many did you hear, sir?
Just one.
Okay.
3, I'm sorry. My wife said she heard 3.
Okay.
And a woman screaming.
All right, we're going to get someone over, sir.
Thank you.
Warning, the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts and injury. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast.
Okay, Wendy, now that we're about to listen to part 2 of the murder of Amanda Ross, what did you think about when we were doing the interview for part 1? Was there anything that stood out for you?
Yeah, the irony that Steve Nunn co-sponsored a bill that became a law that made killing someone a capital offense if they had an active domestic violence order in place. And he co-sponsored this bill and went out and did the very thing that he co-sponsored and wrote a bill on.
I thought the same thing. That was just off the hook crazy, just nuts. A sad irony, really a disgusting irony is probably the way to put it best. I think for me, one thing that I thought about when I was recording and editing and going through this and thinking pieces that I had over the years is this. That in a case like this, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, the victim had a domestic violence order, but it was just a piece of paper. And sometimes that can be true when these come to a tragic end, but those are the outliers. I think people need to remember that most of the time the system works and it works well. So when we hear a case that has an outcome that we didn't desire, it's important not to abandon faith in the case and to continue pressing your case to make sure that you get the safety that you need and make sure that the offender is punished appropriately. So I want people to pay attention to that to make sure that they know resources are available. And again, like we talked about last time, if you've been a victim or know somebody's a victim, just be careful listening to this because it can really be personal to listen to on the activities of a suspect and what happens to a victim. And again, for resources, if you believe you're a victim, then make sure you call your local police or sheriff's department or 911. And on a national level, there's some resources that are easily available to you by calling the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E. They also have a very resourceful website that you can reach. And the cool thing about this website is if you go there, you can actually clean your tracks as you leave so nobody can follow you on your computer and realize that you were searching for this or interacting with them. That website is located at www.thehotline.org. So remember those resources are there for you. Was there anything else you took from the case as we move into episode 2?
No, I think I was just blown away by you. Most people feel like a person of certain stature in their community, you would never imagine that they would do something as horrendous as this. And I know that it can happen to anybody and any domestic abuser can be of any stature, but it just blew me away that still that he wrote this law, co-sponsored it, and was the very abuser that he was trying to protect people from.
You make a fantastic point. And maybe the listeners are aware of this because they've listened to us a few times. You can't judge a book by its cover. And one thing after 28 years in law enforcement taught me is that these evil acts, these bad acts, the things that happen, they don't know economic or social guidelines. They don't know any of that. They can be anywhere. I've seen incredible drug dealing in multi-million-dollar homes. I've seen the same thing with crazy weapon possession and trafficking. It doesn't matter that just because somebody has stature doesn't mean that they're immune to behaving this way. That's an important thing to remember as we move on. So let's finish up with part 2 of the murder of Amanda Ross.
All right, let's do it.
In 2007, he publicly backed Democrat Steve Beshear for governor. Governor Beshear ended up winning that election and placed Mr. Nunn on his transition team and gave him a sweetheart job as the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services within the state of Kentucky.
Okay, you got to dig on that. This is just full of irony and craziness. Yeah. What do they do in that cabinet?
Well, one of their primary responsibilities is domestic violence. So he's in charge of these programs to help victims of domestic violence and get get legislators to make better laws for domestic violence victims. And he's the number 2 guy in that cabinet in the state of Kentucky.
And he's the number 1 guy in this case, doing exactly what he's trying to help prevent for the rest of the Commonwealth.
Correct.
It's laughable in the irony of it, because on the other side of it is that thankfully it seems like we continue to progress in the avenue of domestic violence. We, especially from the old days, is that we are getting better at moving forward on protecting those victims. But it's just beyond irony that one of the guys that was in charge of that and handling that was actually a very violent perpetrator himself.
Absolutely. Now that I've got him in custody for murder, the real work now begins. Because now I got to take this case from probable cause, which for the layperson, probable cause really means, yeah, he probably did it. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, it's not a very high legal standard. And obviously, to take something to trial, you need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I had a lot of work to do, and my unit had a lot of work to do. And that's one of the things I need to emphasize in this is homicide investigations are a team sport. At this point in time, just 3 days into this investigation, I had 3 different state police posts in Kentucky assist me: the Bowling Green Post, the Frankfort Post, and the Pikeville Post. I had the Versailles Police Department, the Barron County Sheriff, all provide me assistance, on top of the ATF, the State Police Forensic Laboratory. And then when you get to the number of Lexington police detectives that are involved in this case, the homicide unit, the robbery unit, I had special victims because there was a domestic violence angle assisting with it. The intelligence unit was running down information for me. This is not all me. This is a team sport. I'm just basically I'm the starting pitcher. Hopefully I can go 9 innings and close it out. One of the things that, we sit down and have meetings and get together to-do lists and kind of divvy up assignments and whatnot. And we interviewed like 105 people in this case. And this is over months and months and months and going through data. I think the last really big significant interview that I did in this case was almost 9 months after it. And it was going through the results. I took his home computer from his house in Glasgow, Kentucky on a search warrant, and I had it forensically analyzed, tons and tons of data. And as I'm going through all this data, I stumbled across it ended up being a really good witness for us, because one of the things that we ran into in the prosecution of this case was we wanted to prove that this was a cold, deliberate, premeditated act. Mr. Nunn's defense was that Amanda had driven him to a state of extreme emotional disturbance, that he shouldn't be held responsible for murder, more like manslaughter. And that's one of the things in Kentucky, they have this extreme emotional disturbance defense. Well, really what it's made for is I come home from work and my neighbor's in bed with my wife and I kill my neighbor. It's a heat of a moment, a passion. That's what that law is created for. But as with anything in law, it's been perverted and diluted, and now it gets used for everything can be ED. It is what it is. I'm not a lawyer, and unfortunately, I've had to experience a lot of this kind of legal stuff as a detective taking cases to court.
So he was trying to justify his actions by saying that she caused his actions.
Yep.
So basically, it was her fault that he had to shoot.
Yeah. There you go. See, you got it. Some interesting things that happened with this. He ended up hiring some pretty heavy gun attorneys and basically signed over his house and all his belongings to these attorneys. One of the things that we ended up doing is we really had to take an examination of Amanda and Steve's relationship back from the start all the way up to the day of the death. And how they met was Steve actually was hired as a lobbyist at Ross Sinclair Associates. Former Governor Nunn had passed away recently, and Amanda's dad had passed away recently. So they kind of had a bond that they kind of commiserated over the loss of both their fathers. And so they began dating like in August of 2007. The relationship progressed into where he moved in with her at her townhome, at the Upper Square Townhomes in March of 2008. He actually proposed to her on her birthday in 2008, so October 10th of 2008. And then she decided to call off the engagement on October 20th of 2008, so 10 days later. And from what I understand, it was she probably just wasn't ready to get married. She had been married once before, and she was much younger when she was married, so she was a little bit more cautious this time. In December of 2008, she had asked Mr. Nunn to move out of her residence, and they actually had a little domestic violence incident during this him moving out kind of phase. But they stayed together because in early 2009, they went on vacation to Mexico together. And so I guess they come back from vacation, and Amanda has to call the police in regards to a domestic violence incident. She tells the Lexington police she was slapped with an open hand to the face, and he wanted to leave. She wouldn't let him leave, and he slapped her. Mr. Nunn also calls in on the same incident and claims that he's the victim. Well, there's no injuries. Neither party really wanted to press charges. What the officers did was they took what's called a JC3 report, which is a report that goes to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, which
he worked for.
Yeah. But it kind of provides some social work opportunities that makes them aware that, maybe there's some opportunities for social work to intervene on this versus police contact. And the next day, Amanda and her mom end up leaving town, and they go on vacation together. So really where everything kind of really falls apart in their relationship is February 17th, 2009. Amanda called the police to report domestic violence. She had stated that she had been struck in the face 4 times with a closed fist. She had visible redness and bruising on her left cheek. And basically, they were together this evening trying to work on the relationship. They both had some drinks. They get heated. Nunn gets upset and damages property. Amanda confronts him about the damaged property, and he punches her. Now, in the course of him punching her, she punches back. He has a cut on his face where she had a ring on. Amanda was escorted to district court and obtained an emergency protection order against Mr. Nunn, as well as filed an assault force domestic violence charge against him, or complaint against him, which was turned into a charge. So what an EPO is, it's an emergency restraining order that basically a judge says, hey, this allegation is out here, and to keep everybody safe, you're not allowed to do certain things. And so those conditions are stuff like no further acts of violence, no destruction or damage to property, no contact, and that kind of stuff. And usually those last for about 14 days when there's a hearing before a family court judge. 2 days after this incident, he served with the emergency protection order. They get a court date for March 4th for the domestic violence hearing. In the course of the domestic violence hearing, the judge ends up determining that this is a violent relationship involving a domestic relationship. He issues a domestic violence order, a restraining order, if you will, for Amanda against Steve Nunn with the conditions that there are to be no further acts of violence. Steve is not to have any contact with Amanda, no damaging or disposal of property. And he also adds a little caveat on there that's called what we call a gun stamp. He orders Mr. Nunn not to possess firearms. Obviously, he had a firearm the day that he killed Amanda.
Well, and I have to say also, these cases, the two domestic violence cases, or episodes rather, they were a mere 3 weeks apart.
Yes.
When he struck her the first time and then the second time.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask, is that no gun stamp? Do you think that's because the judge suspicion that may be an issue, or is that typical that they say no guns?
It's usually pretty typical that in domestic violence cases, and especially if they see any kind of physical violence, that a judge will issue a no gun order on there. It's something that happens quite frequently. So it's not. I don't think there's anything specific in this case that would have led the judge to believe that guns would have came into it. I think it's just his standard operating when he actually sees that there's physical violence in a relationship. In this case, the judge put that on there. I don't think it was anything out of the ordinary for the judge, but he saw actual physical violence in the relationship, so he put the order not to possess a gun on there.
That was a fantastic question, too, because fortunately, most people aren't exposed to this. The people that are exposed learn very quickly, too quickly probably, which brings me to something I want to point out, that so far, she has reported when we would say we want people to report. The system has engaged back, and it sounds like it's engaged commensurate with the reporting and the elements, and the protections are in place. And I just want to point that out, that she's doing what I think we say is ideal, because a lot of unfair criticism of domestic violence victims sometimes is, well, he or she didn't report this, which means it may not have happened. But right now, it sounds like all the cogs in this system are clicking the way they're supposed to. And I just wanted to point that out.
Obviously, on March 4th, when he has this hit with his DVO, and Mr. Nunn is forced to resign his position with the Cabinet for Health and Family Services within the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Yeah, I would imagine you can't write that law.
Correct.
Or support that law.
Correct.
And go out and break the law that you worked so hard to create.
Correct. And in fact, to one of my favorite quotes in this case was somebody I was interviewing that was within the administration of the Commonwealth of Kentucky at that time, said the governor can't have no woman beaters at the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So I found that rather amusing and kind of stuck with me for a while. So Mr. Dunn now begins a path seeking retribution and revenge on Amanda. He's lost his job, but she still has a very good job with the state. So he takes off on things that doing things and committing acts that lead to this awful tragedy happening. And one thing, Amanda was at this point in time terribly scared of this dude. And this comes from talking to all her friends and her family. She ends up getting a gun from a family friend, carrying it in her purse. She had a carrying concealed permit, and she carried a gun specifically because she was scared of Mr. Nunn. Her townhome to the left of it had this little cobblestone walkway that went around the back of her back patio. She referred to that as OJ Alley. And the reason is that time period in the fall of 2008, from when they get unengaged and they're kind of off again, on again, she catches him out in this, staring in her windows in this little walkway around to the back of her house. So she called that OJ Alley. And in fact, she had her a former brother-in-law of hers come over and put security lights out there for her, because she literally had caught him out there staring in her windows prior to them officially breaking up. Mr. Nunn's first attempts to get retribution and revenge, he starts contacting her friends and family, trying to get them to get her to drop the issue on him and drop the domestic violence order. So this actually causes another hearing for Mr. Nunn for domestic violence purposes, because Amanda had to file a police report because he's violated the no contact using a third party. Then we learn that in April of 2009, Mr. Nunn goes to the Keeneland horse racing track, and he's walking around with a racing program And inside the racing program, he has several 8.5 by 11 flyers that he has created, handbills, if you will, that contain a pornographic image of Amanda. He has little vile statements written on those. Probably the only one that I'll halfway repeat, because he basically said something to the effect of "psycho bitch alert. If located, contact Eastern State Hospital," which is our mental health facility here in Lexington, Kentucky. The rest were all very vile and lewd in nature. He had her phone number listed on there, kind of like he'd say something completely vile and lewd and then put down at the bottom for a good time and have her phone number listed. And he's running around Keeneland showing these off to people. And a lot of the people he's shown to are mutual acquaintances between the two of them. And, this isn't, both Amanda and Steve are blue bloods. And he's showing these off in the dining rooms in the clubhouse area of Keeneland, where a lot of blue bloods are at.
What's a blue blood in Kentucky? Because people are going to wonder what that is.
It's going to be, somebody of political prominence or somebody with money. And, it's kind of the movers and shakers of the state, if you will.
So it sounds like he was just trying to make every effort to embarrass and demean her with mutual friends. I guess the old misery loves company comes into play here.
Correct. And so he's also contacting her ex-spouse, her sister, ex-boyfriends, and friends of hers, trying to dig up dirt for his domestic violence case. She finds out about the flyers in June, and has to file another violation of the domestic violence order. And so they actually have to go to court in July of 2009. And the judge orders Mr. Nunn to return all images of her and not to engage in any more conduct like this, or he's going to find him in violation. In the meantime, Mr. Nunn's hospitalized a couple times during this time period for blood clots, which is why he's on blood thinners. And then in early August, he ends up getting a plea deal for the domestic violence case. He takes what's called an Alford plea and pleads to criminal mischief third degree, and he gets diversion. And basically, so what the diversion is if he goes and does community service and gets an alcohol assessment, it all disappears. And so what an Alford...
Yeah, what jurisdiction did that happen in before? And I interrupt. Where was that at?
Fayette County's District Court.
Okay.
Is that typical? I mean, I'm just kind of confused here because so I'm guessing because of his political stance and who his father was, he's given this, which is really a slap in the face to the victim. And what it says, what I would feel like if I were in her shoes or any victim's shoes, if that person just goes and does some community service, their record is wiped clean as though it never happened, which means that he in turn is going to go seek out another victim or possibly come back for her again. I just find that really utterly ridiculous.
It was. Now I do believe the county attorney's office probably spoke with Amanda and got some input for him to be able to get this, because typically that's what the county attorney or the Commonwealth attorney see. In Kentucky, you have your prosecutor's office. You have two prosecutors' office. You have a county attorney, which basically is primarily responsible for misdemeanor cases, and assault force domestic violence is a misdemeanor case. And then you have the Commonwealth attorney's office, which prosecutes felonies, basically. And both, from my experience, the county attorney and their victim advocates and the Commonwealth attorney and their victim advocates, they're all pretty good about working with victims. Amanda, I don't know if she approved of the deal or not, but I'm fairly confident she was made aware of it.
What kind of community service are we talking? Out on the road, picking up trash? Much worse than that. He worked with his best friend at the Barren River Lake State Resort Park golf course. Wow. Some punishment for community service. Yeah. As I'm working through this case, earlier I mentioned that in that psycho bitch file, there was a letter to Amanda's mother, where I was talking about earlier that 9 months down the road, I find some information on his computer. I actually found that letter and in an email that he sent to a former coworker all the way back in April of 2009. And he never sent it. And so, I immediately called Diana and I actually had shown Diana this letter and said, "Hey, did you ever get this?" "No, I never got it."
So that was kind of, we're trying to show that all these little petty attempts of him to demean and destroy Amanda's reputation aren't working. So I think it's, I also found a letter that, was in with all his documents and property that was dated August 14th of 2009. And it was addressed to his daughters. And there was a line in it that said, if I can't fulfill my one wish / goal / revenge / retaliation, then I will have failed. So that's about a month before the homicide, and he's talking revenge retaliation to his daughters. So really, the key thing with this investigation is the timeline of the week of the homicide. So it kind of boils down to really taking a heavy examination into that week. The murder happened on a Friday morning. On Monday of that week, he has dinner with his daughters at his home. They help him update his resume, and they think he's coming out of his depression that he's been in and think everything's going to be fine. So he goes the next day to a car dealership in Glasgow, and he drops off his SUV for repair. And the owner of the car dealership gives him a ride home. And he asks the owner of the car dealership to fax his community service paperwork showing where he's completed his community service back to Fayette District Court. And he asked the owner of the car dealership for lunch, to do lunch, and they don't end up having lunch. But later in the day, Mr. Nunn shows back up at the dealership with his own lunch. They're sitting in his office, and Mr. Nunn's still belly aching about Amanda and saying that it cost him $130,000. He had to do all this community service, that she ruined his life. And, the owner of the car dealership's kind of cuts him off and says, hey, you ruined your own life when you laid your hand on a woman. So Mr. Nunn makes a statement like, I don't know what I have to live for. And the owner of the car dealership's like, your family, your daughters. So then we later learn that he leaves Glasgow that day and comes to Lexington, where he meets up with two prostitutes and pays them $400 for 1 hour and has sexual relations with them.
Wow. Well, he was trying to certainly work out his misery, sounds like.
And we end up tracking and we discover this through going through his phone records and his computer. And he spent a lot of time and money and energy seeking out the comforts of women for pay, basically throughout that summer. And he joined a website that was where he became a sugar daddy, and he sought out sugar babies for relationships. And so, we had to go through all this stuff and get that stuff from the sugar daddy websites and that kind of stuff.
Sounds like he was looking for more victims.
I don't necessarily think he was looking for more victims. He had some, well, hell, let's just say he's a creep. Was a kind of a creepy dude that you wouldn't expect somebody of his lineage to act like that. But honestly, probably the biggest, most important day in this case is Wednesday, September 9th, 2009. Mr. Nunn's in Lexington the night before. He gets up and he goes to Frankfort, which is the state capital. He starts hobnobbing in the state house and the governor's office and what's called the Legislative Research Center. He ends up running into the governor's chief of staff and communication director, and they engage him in a few minutes of small talk. The thing that's interesting about this is the letter that is the 7-page manifesto in the Psychovich file is dated September 9th, 2009. He basically complains that while in Frankfurt, he's treated like a leper and people keep their distance. And basically he's running around Frankfurt saying, hey, look, I completed my community service. Give me a handout. And that's not happening. But all the folks that I interviewed in Frankfurt said, yeah, we had a pleasant conversation with them. Said it was good to see him back, wished him the best of luck. And, in this guy's warped mind, he thinks that he's being treated like a leper. So also that day, he makes a phone call to a friend in Lexington, and he makes a comment to him that he doesn't know whether he should murder somebody or go get a job.
Decisions, huh?
So I learned that Mr. Nunn, while in Frankfurt, is getting ready to head back to Glasgow. And at that time, you couldn't purchase alcohol in Glasgow. He calls a couple of friends to say, hey, I'm going to stop at the Rite Aid and pick up some alcohol. do you all need anything while I'm up here kind of thing. And he just happens to have a chance encounter with Amanda at this Rite Aid in Frankfort. He's there to buy liquor. He's walking out and she's pulling up the store she ran to get vitamins or something from on her lunch break. And they see each other. She takes off. Now, Mr. Nunn tells KSP that he saw her there and that she tried to run him over. However, Amanda comes back to work. She's scared to death. She's visibly shaken, and her boss ends up sending her home for the rest of the day because she's so upset. In my professional opinion, that's when at that point in time, he's decided she's dead. He's tried all these other methods to get revenge, to take her down. They've been unsuccessful. He's been unsuccessful. And that's why that letter was dated September 9th. That's why he started to lay his plan out on that day. Because what's interesting is so the next day, Thursday, September 10th, he starts texting his second ex-wife and asks her to call. He basically asks her to go to his house in Glasgow and take care of his girls. She asks him if he's going on a trip. He chuckles and says he has to sort some things out. He then drives to Bowling Green where his daughters live, and he exchanges his Lexus with one of his daughters to get her black Honda car. That's it's a 2-door with tinted windows and a spoiler. And he tells her he's borrowing her car to take a road trip, and her car has more miles than his Lexus does. So she found it odd, but in her mind, she was an early 20-something that's getting to drive a Lexus for while dad's taking her car on a trip. So she didn't think much about it. And then the other odd thing is, I brought this up earlier. He went to a business called Borders Monument in Glasgow, and he was very insistent on seeing the proprietor of that store, the owner. And what happened is when his mother passed away, she initially was buried in a different spot, and he wanted his mother with his father. He paid to move mom from where she's buried at to the cemetery beside her father, and he kept his mother's original tombstone at Borders Monument, and it was going to be his tombstone. So they had a little 8.5 by 14 sheet of paper that had a sketch of how he wanted his tombstone. And he was very insistent on seeing that, wrote his date of death on there. So it had his name, Stephen Roberts Nunn, his date of birth, and then Mr. Nunn adds his date of death as September 11th, 2009.
Does the owner question that? That just
absolutely. Well, crazy. He doesn't know Mr. Nunn all that well. So he actually makes some phone calls to some people who do know Mr. Nunn. A couple of Mr. Nunn's friends, they have this incident at the monument store, and then he called and said some strange things to his ex-wife. So both those people get a hold of a couple of his friends. They go over to the residence and sit there with them, and then they take him out to dinner. At the they spend several hours with him, and they think they've kind of got him over his little. Got him over the hump. They think that everything's, going to be okay. And then, they get up the next morning and turn on the news and realize that their worlds are kind of shook up and turned upside down at this point in time. And another really neat thing that happened in this case, forensic wise, if y'all honor me and let me talk about it. One of the things that we did in this case, one of my partners in the homicide unit, Dave Richardson, had been to some training and saw a presentation on video forensic analysis, thought that it would be useful in this case. So we ended up hiring a company out of Washington State called Video Forensic Solutions, I believe what it was. They ended up coming into town, looking basically at the car and at the school. And we went out and we got a couple very similar cars, and they did a forensic analysis of the videotape compared to the car, compared to other cars. And they were able to positively identify the car on the video from Harrison Elementary as being Mr. Nunn's daughter's car, and the car that we see on the video 3 minutes after the shots are fired on the morning of September 11th, 2009. So that was kind of really neat evidence that added to the just another piece to this puzzle. Because ultimately, I still don't have any really direct evidence. I've got Mr. Nunn, like I'm monitoring his jail phone calls at this point in time, and I've got him saying stuff to he's talking to his ex-wife or his daughters. He's talking to them, and he makes statements like, I'm sorry that it happened, but I'm glad she's gone. Or he's talking about writing a book, and he's going to name the title of the book, She Killed Me First. But he doesn't actually say, I did it. But he's saying stuff like this, which is just another little piece, very good piece. And, you know, in front of a jury, they're going to look at that and go, oh yeah, this guy's wrong. You know, another thing that I did was we ended up contacting the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. At that time, Kentucky did kind of an archaic method of obtaining gunshot residue. We knew Tennessee had the newest test, and we reached out to them, and they provided us a sample kit because I wanted gunshot residue testing done inside of his car. Because in my thought process, he's just shot Amanda. He jumps in this car and he's gone. He's got to transfer that gunshot residue to the steering wheel, gear shift, door, passenger or driver door handle. We end up getting this test kit. Forensic Services Unit processes the car for me and uses this test kit. I send it down to Tennessee, and sure enough, we end up getting gunshot residue off the steering wheel, gear shift, and the door handle. So that was another nice little piece of evidence. So as this, you know, case is progressing through the court system, you know, we see that this is going to be you know, the way they're not going to deny that he did it. They're going to basically try to say she forced him to do it by filing domestic violence order on him and all that kind of stuff. Everything that I've talked about and that I've done has kind of been our counter to is, yeah, he spiraled out of control after he lost his job, but this wasn't a spur of the moment thing. He had planned it. He had taken very deliberate steps to get to the homicide. If you go back and remember my initial description of what the 911 call was, and what the witness statements were, we heard gunshots, we heard a female pleading for her life, and we heard more gunshots. So he's lying. It's dark when she comes out to get to her car. He shoots her in the torso and then walks up on her, and she's pleading for her life, and he shoots her 2 more times in the head. This isn't not extreme emotional disturbance. This is cold-blooded murder. It's premeditated.
I think it's important because you hit this earlier for the listeners because it's different in different states. In Kentucky, in a murder, we don't have to prove motive. And a lot of
Correct.
people really think it's on that. And what's more important in Kentucky is that mindset and where that intent is. And that's why you're hitting that so well, is that motive is nice because you can manage a case with it. Motive is really clear in this, but I think you're hitting the information so well on why this intent thing matters and what it takes to prove that. So thank you for doing that for the listeners.
Ultimately, what ends up happening in this case, the defense ended up filing a motion to suppress on 28 different issues. And so we end up having a very lengthy multi-day suppression hearing, which is really a mini trial in itself. I spent the better part of one day and part of another day on the stand as the lead investigator, kind of going through all this stuff. We had the detective sergeant from KSP come in and talk about the statement. They tried to suppress little things. The initial troopers that found him in the cemetery, they tried to get their statements suppressed. It's a defense tactic. The more stuff that they can file suppression issues on, it helps them in their defense of their client. So out of 28 issues, we ended up winning 25 of them. We did lose part of his statement because he does make a statement as he's talking to the trooper, and he gets keyed up and he talks about he just wanted revenge. And the trooper says, "Hey, is that why you killed her?" And he makes a statement well, I don't know, maybe I should talk to an attorney. And the trooper is well, do you want an attorney? No, let's talk about something else. So they go back to talking about something else. And then, later on, he comes back, gets keyed up again. So we end up winning 25 of these suppression issues. So it kind of really shot down a lot of their case, a lot of what they were going to try to do. In June of 2011, our Commonwealth Attorney's Office received communication from Mr. Nunn's legal team that he was willing to plead guilty to this. And so a plea agreement was put together with the blessing of Amanda's mother, that he was going to plead guilty to murder and avoid the death penalty, but and accept life in prison without the possibility of parole as a punishment. So he ended up pleading guilty June 28, 2011, admits that he killed Amanda in open court.
So he actually verbally admitted that he killed her in court?
Yes.
That's powerful in and of itself. That's something the victims' families and those surviving friends need to hear often. One
of the other things that happened, this case went on forever with me. There was a civil trial after the criminal trial in regards to wrongful death that I had to participate in. During the wrongful death suit was filed while the criminal case was still open and my investigation was still ongoing. So I would get contacted by Amanda's family's attorney asking questions, and I couldn't answer the question. I didn't know if I could answer the questions or not because of my criminal case. So I would have to go back and forth with the Commonwealth attorney. Hey, they called and asked me this. Can I answer it? And so it kind of a trying situation there for a little bit. But once the criminal case was over, then I was free and clear. I went and met with them basically for an afternoon. We went through everything, and they had everything that they needed. So here's another interesting little thing in Kentucky. If you take a case to trial and you get found guilty by a jury, you pretty much can file unlimited appeals for the rest of your life. However, you take a plea deal, you're not entitled to an appeal except on one special circumstance, and it's called an 1142. What that is in Kentucky is ineffective counsel. And so within 3 years of your plea deal, you have to have a ineffective counsel appeal filed. And sure enough, almost 3 years is coming up. So in May and June of 2014, there was another hearing in this case that was involving ineffective counsel. Ultimately, the judge in the case ruled that she felt that Mr. Nunn's legal team adequately represented him and provided him all the facts and information that he needed prior to pleading guilty. But, there were just all kinds of things that came up from time to time.
I think on that 1142, what's interesting for people that aren't around is you have to remember that he probably did have excellent representation. He was probably able to afford it if he sold his assets to get it. And then 28 suppression items. That is not ineffective counsel. That's somebody that is really advocating for their client. And there's another thing called protecting the record. They are actually building in a record that they're effective. So it's kind of astonishing that he even go for that ineffective counsel thing. Clearly, he was represented very well, maybe more than other people are. But that's an interesting thing that you hit on with the 28.
Yeah, I do recall as they were preparing for the ineffective counsel, I remember I had to go to a hearing in regards to he wanted, obviously, when he was indicted, we provided his defense team with discovery, and they got to have everything that I had. When I talked about that box of pornography that he had, they didn't have copies of that. But they came over and sat down in a small room with me, and they were able to open the box up, look at every bit of it, take notes of it, that kind of thing. It wasn't something we were going to give, certainly weren't going to give to anybody. But in my case file, I had those flyers that he created of Amanda, and I had a couple other photos of her in the case file that were relevant. It was like an investigative memo that I typed that I referenced one of those pictures. So I put that picture in there. He wanted those pictures in prison. We thought that was a terrible idea.
People can't see it, but I just jaw dropped and rolled my eyes like I haven't in a long time.
And we legit had a hearing, and hell, even the Department of Corrections sent somebody into this hearing. They thought it was preposterous. Where's he going to be able to store 3,000 documents and that kind of thing? There was some sort of compromise that was made, but he didn't get any of the photos. Like, we were able to go in and redact and cut and take out the photos, but he could have all the other pertinent documentation because that's his right. Can you imagine him having these obscene photos in prison? He'd be a popular guy because the circumstances around this case. I think there were like 3 TV shows done on it. It's all because of the revenge factor. It's pretty salacious details with the revenge aspect of it. The fact that he's the one that created the legislation that made killing somebody, with the domestic violence order a capital offense. On the flip side, there were some positive things that came out of this case. Amanda's mother became a advocate for domestic violence issues. She was able to use her connections and go to Frankfurt and lobby. There was a law passed in Amanda's name that's known as Amanda's Law that passed basically what the law is, that it allows for GPS monitoring of offenders in domestic violence cases. Amanda's mother always told me that, if she didn't know that, this would have qualified it for an app, but certainly if Amanda was able to pull up on her phone or her computer and look at the location of Steve Nunn, she sure as hell wouldn't have walked out of townhome that morning. There was this law created in Amanda's memory. And then Fayette County Sheriff Kathy Witt developed a really strong relationship with Diana. And Kathy Witt is a very another staunch advocate for domestic violence victims and has a lot of programs in the sheriff's office for domestic violence victims. And so she created what she calls the Amanda Center, which provides services and help to domestic violence victims in Fayette County. In this tragedy, there is some silver lining.
Yeah, you don't want to have to develop laws and put them in place because of a tragedy, but sometimes they'll demonstrate the need. And I think what's unique about Amanda's law is, like we talked about before, is we get better with domestic violence laws, but there's still gap filling that has to happen because protective orders themselves sometimes are just not enough. They get the process started, they get it recognized, and they potentially offer protections. But I love the idea that now that there's more motion forward on filling those gaps for protecting these people. And I'll say, too, that Sheriff Witt, I got to work with her for years, is a passionate victims advocate across the board. And in our show, we have show notes, and I'll post links to a lot of these things that we've talked about today, during these episodes that people come back and reflect on.
Todd, thank you so much for sharing this case. It's certainly sad, and we appreciate your time and the time and dedication you put forth to get justice for Amanda Ross.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. David, thank you.
No, this was a fantastic case, and it's a testament to how wonderful Todd is as an investigator, because when you have that much detail and that much work, that's a testament to how well he performed in that position, and that's what brought justice to this young lady. The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. This podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.